This is one of the most recognizable photographs of the 20th century. An Afghan refugee girl on the cover of National Geographic magazine in 1985. It would be published during the worst moment of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. In 10 years of war, almost 6 million people will leave the country. And these are probably the most recognizable shots of 2021. The last American planes leave Afghanistan with nothing after 20 years of war. Why does everyone need Afghanistan so much? And what do these lands in the heart of Asia hide? Instead of a prosperous country with fantastic tourism and developed agriculture, why are drugs and endless wars being cultivated here? How will Afghanistan become a graveyard of empires? And what danger does it pose to the world in the future? What do you associate Afghanistan with today? Well, probably men with machine guns, women in burqas, endless poppy fields and drug addicts, maimed children. And all of this is now ruled by the Taliban terrorist organization, which no one in the world officially recognizes, but its leaders travel to all official negotiations. Today, fighting in Afghanistan is not a profession, but a way of life. If you go back half a century, you will find that the country, though poor, is quite safe. At the capital's airport in Kabul, happy tourists, men in stylish European suits, women with children in short, colorful dresses get off the plane. And these women, already local Afghans, can be found on the central streets of Kabul. The Afghan ruler is being honored in the capital of the United States. And Western youth at this time freely races through Afghanistan on their famous hippie trail. In ancient times, this road connected China with India, with Persia, with the Middle East and Europe. That is why it is beautifully called the crossroads of peoples and civilizations, or the solar plexus of Eurasia. But remember, I said at the very beginning that Afghanistan has a much better known nickname, the graveyard of empires. Why would someone who considers himself the most powerful in the region or the world try to conquer Afghanistan? Maybe to control trade? I don't think so. Because for the last 500 years, global business is not caravans of donkeys and camels across mountains and deserts. It's trading ships. They are the ones that keep the world's trade flowing. So Afghanistan, which is not and never has been landlocked, has nothing to do with it. Maybe there is gold, oil, and gas there, but if you compare it with its neighbors Iran, Turkmenistan, or Uzbekistan, Afghanistan has neither of these, nor the other, nor the third. So what is there? There is such a Napoleonic phrase, geography is destiny. So Afghanistan's destiny is to be the only land corridor from Central Asia to India, to the Persian Gulf. If someone militarily controls Afghanistan, it means that he can influence all of them at once: India, Pakistan, China, Central Asia, and therefore on Russia. That is why Afghanistan has been in the news for decades. Well, the problems of modern Afghanistan begin with the confrontation between colonial Britain and terrorist Russia. 19th century. At this time, the British Empire is the most powerful power on the planet. London controls 1/5 of world trade and 2/5 of world production. Why? Because Britain has the strongest navy and the largest possessions. The key colony, of course, is India. Why? First, there are a lot of resources that are important at the time: cotton, tea, indigo. Second, there's a lot of workforce there, approximately 200 million people. And thirdly, India is the geographical center of world trade between Asia, Africa, and Europe. The question arises, what is Russia and Afghanistan involved in this? Look, the Russian Empire is huge, but it remains land-based. The only exits to the warm trading seas are the Straits of Bosphorus and Dardanelles in the Black Sea. But they're controlled by Turkey. You've probably heard of the Crimean War? It starts because Turkey is weak at the time, and Russia wants to take the straits for itself and enter the Mediterranean Sea in order to gain better access to the world's oceans and compete with the great colonial powers. But the largest colonial powers, France and England, do not want that. They therefore support Turkey. As a result, Russia loses the war and St. Petersburg is left without warm seas and oceans. What to do? The Russians change direction and go east. There's a painting called The Apotheosis of War. Vasily Vereshchagin creates it under the impression of Russian conquests in Central Asia. In 1865, Russia conquers Tashkent, in 67th Bukhara, in 68th Samarkand, in 73rd Khanate of Khiva, in 76th Khanate of Kokand. Next on the map is Afghanistan, and the warm Indian Ocean is not far off. London doesn't like this arrangement very much. Russia needs Afghanistan as a springboard or a key, or a gateway to the Indian Ocean. Why does the UK need it? Like a buffer, or a barrier, or a minefield to keep the Russians from getting through. But there's a problem. It will be described very accurately by this young British soldier who served in Afghanistan at the end of the 19th century. Tribe war with tribe. The inhabitants of one valley fight with those who live next to it. Every fellow tribe is considered a blood enemy of his neighbor, one warring against another, but all against strangers. Private's name is Winston Churchill. The very Churchill who would become British Prime Minister would share the world with Stalin and Roosevelt and bring down the Iron Curtain between the USSR and the West. Churchill was very precise about the main root of the evil of Afghanistan. It will never be possible to create a truly unified state here, to unite around something common. There is no single or predominant people in Afghanistan. The country is like a patchwork blanket. There are Pashtuns, Tajiks, and Hazaras, Uzbeks, Turkmen. There is also no official single language. Some speak Pashto, some speak Dari. And there are also Balak, Uzbek, and again other languages smaller. You ask, what about Islam? Islam is the only thing that globally unites the Afghan peoples, but does not cancel out the potential enmity between them. But a much greater rage arises among Afghans toward foreigners. Why? This is what Churchill wrote about his British army. We acted systematically, village by village. We destroyed houses, filled in wells, demolished towers, cut down large shade trees, burned crops, and destroyed reservoirs in a punitive devastation. In doing so, Winston himself calls the Afghans savages, barbarians, and a degenerate race living on the margins of humanity. Imagine this. Some strong and unfamiliar guys come to your house all the time and try to impose their own orders. The result there is simply no peaceful population left in the country, because any peasant to protect himself and his house starts hiding a gun at home. Any woman takes a knife in her hands, and any child from early childhood is ready to kill a foreigner. In essence, everyone who tries to conquer Afghanistan is stepping on the same rake. It is not a huge army that has to be fought, but guerrillas, Afghan nomads and peasants for whom war is not a job, but a way of life. It is this kind of unprofitable guerrilla warfare that has led to the demise of empires time after time. For example, this is a portable Stinger surface-to-air missile system. It's lightweight, doesn't emit radio waves, so it's very difficult to detect the shooter before he fires. And after the shot is fired, the shooter can hide very easily. And so, on September 25th, 1986, Afghan Field Commander Abdul Ghaffar fired a Stinger for the first time at Soviet helicopters coming in for a landing at the Jalalabad airport. What happened next? By the summer of 1987, according to some reports, the Afghans were shooting down 1 or 2 Mi-24s a day. Now let's do the math. One shot from a Stinger costs $40,000 to $70,000. A helicopter costs more than $10 million. The conclusion, you can't go against the physics and math of war, especially if we take into account that the Americans are sending thousands of such complexes to the Mujahideen. As a result, Soviet aviation is no longer a military trump card, but a constant source of monetary and human losses. Here, perhaps, the main question is relevant. Why did the Soviet Union go into Afghanistan in the first place? Now it seems that it was for nothing. The country will lose $30 to $50 billion in the war, 15,000 Soviet soldiers will officially die, and 53,000 more will be wounded. In general, the economy and ideology of the USSR on the Afghan adventure will give a crack and eventually collapse. But at the moment the war starts, namely in 1979, it seems to the Russians that everything will be fine. There is enough money because oil prices have skyrocketed. The US economy, as the main adversary of the Soviet Union, stops growing. There is record inflation and unemployment. There is an Islamic revolution in Iraq, and the US loses its staunchest ally, Shah Pahlavi. A month before the invasion in Islamabad, Pakistan, locals burned down the American embassy with cries of death to America when but now. The enemy is weak, and the Soviets will have another loyal controlled ally in the form of Afghanistan. In general, it was decided to take Afghanistan and establish their own order there. But alas, there will be no more civilians left in Afghanistan. All Afghans will either fight or become accomplices of those who fight. All these 10 years, the Americans will conduct Operation Cyclone against the USSR, train the Mujahideen, and supply weapons, including those very same Stingers. The total check will amount to about $3 billion. However, these investments can hardly be called successful, because in addition to fighters against the Soviet army, they will bring up the most famous terrorist in history, Osama bin Laden, who organized the bombings of September 11, 2001. And everything will end with the fact that the US itself, together with NATO, will get into Afghanistan and in 20 years will leave the country with the same result as the British Empire and the Soviet Union. But we must realize that behind every such war and multi-billion-dollar expenditures, seemingly in vain, there are actually specific people. Look, there's a businessman named Robert Stevens. From 2004 to 2013, he will be the head of Lockheed Martin Corporation. It produces everything for the American Army airplanes, missiles, surveillance systems, drones, and equipment. So Stevens, in addition to his base salary, will earn about $75 million in bonuses during the Afghan war. Or, for example, Stephen Orenstein, owner of Supreme Foods, will receive $5.5 billion worth of contracts from the U.S. government from 2005 through 2011 to supply fresh food to U.S. troops. Then there's Eric Prince, founder of the private military company Blackwater. In 2007, he gets a $1 billion contract from the federal government to fight in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Or there's these young guys. At the age of 25, they will beat out the Pentagon for $300 million to supply weapons, ammunition to the Americans and the Afghan army. Why am I telling you all this? Firstly, any war is a dirty business from which everyone is trying to make money. And secondly, Afghanistan is a perfect example of when no one cares about the country and its people. This country is needed only to realize its geopolitical ambitions, and for some just to make money. And everyone, the British, the Soviet Union, the Americans, tried to give Afghanistan their civilization without asking whether they needed it. But time passes. The only thing that is growing in the country is the number of terrorist attacks and opium production. By 2010, 97% of Afghanistan's GDP will come from foreign aid, according to the International Monetary Fund. And when the US finally leaves the country and the Taliban comes to power almost without a fight, take a look at their first official document dated August 19, 2021. This is a declaration of victory over the British Empire, the USSR, and the USA. And today, on the one hand, it seems wild that, for example, Lavrov or representatives of China sit down at the negotiating table with guys whom they officially consider to be terrorists. And on the other hand, again, everyone has their own interests here. For example, in the mid-noughties, there were two curious pieces of news. A Chinese state-owned corporation was granted a 30-year, $3 billion concession to develop copper deposits in Afghanistan's Mes-Aynak Valley. It is indeed home to one of the largest copper deposits in the world. Another Chinese national oil corporation has won a tender to drill oil wells already in the north of the country. Beijing seems to be choosing the wisest way to interact with its neighbor. Not to introduce troops and hand out money that immediately dissolves in the mountains, but to quietly and peacefully pump out resources and build infrastructure on credit, like China is doing in Africa. Just so you understand, in 2019, Afghanistan's Ministry of Mines and Petroleum estimates the total value of the country's natural wealth at $3 trillion. Afghanistan has plenty of iron ore and coal, but most importantly, lithium and other rare earth metals. In the Pentagon report for the year 2010, Afghanistan is listed as Lithium Saudi Arabia. It is clear that lithium is a key component for all kinds of batteries. And if we take into account that the whole world is going to switch to electric cars, it would be very profitable for Afghanistan to engage in lithium mining. But why has no one invested in this business so far? It is simple, no one wants to take risks. Then another question, why is China or Russia meeting with Taliban representatives? Probably because they want to take the risk after all. What conclusion can be drawn about Afghanistan? In the near future, this country will definitely not cease to be one of the world's main problems, at least as a source of drug trafficking and terrorism. But these problems have been fanned by the great powers themselves, their ambitions and greed. The big question is whether they will continue to capitalize on it. or whether they will leave the area alone and just try to listen. Remember, I mentioned Vereshchagin's Apotheosis of War. Besides being a brilliant painting, you can find very important words on its frame dedicated to all great conquerors past, present, and future. All attempts to conquer Afghanistan and establish their own order there ended with the same apotheosis. If you like the content, then don't forget to like it, write a comment, and share this video with your friends.